May 3, 1945. The Austrian Alps. The morning mist clings to the jagged peaks of the Tyrolean mountains, muffling the sounds of a war that is, for all intents and purposes, already over. A young American private, Fred Schneikert, stands guard at a lonely roadblock when a group of bedraggled men emerges from the tree line. One man, his arm in a plaster cast, steps forward with a strange air of confidence. This is Werner von Braun, the mastermind behind the V-2 rockets that rained death on London. He does not come as a prisoner begging for mercy, but as a merchant offering a world-ending commodity. In his pockets are no maps of minefields or troop concentrations, but the blueprints for the future of human destruction. As he surrenders, the official history records a victory for democracy. But beneath the surface, a new, darker ledger is being opened. The guns are falling silent across the ruins of Europe, but for the men in the shadow of these mountains, the real struggle for the soul of the 20th century is only just beginning. The truth of what these men have done, and what they are about to do for their new masters, is a secret that will remain buried beneath layers of classified files for decades to come. By the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was a hollowed-out shell, retreating on all fronts, yet its technological output had reached a terrifying, feverish peak. In the Allied high commands of London and Washington, a chilling realization began to take hold. The Germans were not just fighting a war of attrition. They were conducting a massive, desperate experiment in advanced physics, rocketry, and chemical warfare. The intelligence reports reaching General Dwight D. Eisenhower's desk spoke of vengeance weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 supersonic rocket that bypassed all traditional defenses. The military environment was one of paradoxical urgency. While Allied soldiers pushed toward the Rhine, the scientists and intelligence officers of the ALSO's mission and the CIOS, Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, were in a different kind of race. They weren't looking for occupied territory. They were looking for the brains that had made the wonder weapons possible. The world situation was shifting from a unified front against fascism into a fractured scramble for the remnants of German genius. The Allied T-Forces, specialized units designed to seize industrial and scientific targets, were given lists of priority objectives that often superseded tactical military needs. They were hunting for the Mittelwerk, a subterranean factory carved into the Kohnstein mountain, where thousands of slave laborers were dying to produce the rockets that would later form the basis of the American and Soviet space programs. The scale of this technological gap was staggering. When Allied investigators first laid eyes on German jet aircraft like the Me-262 or the blueprints for the America bomber, they realized that Germany had been years, perhaps a decade, ahead in specific fields of aerodynamics and propulsion. Forces involved in this shadow hunt included the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department and the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. But they were increasingly looking over their shoulders at their Soviet allies. The Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, had agreed on the partition of Germany at Yalta, but the secret protocols of the scientific hunt ignored these borders. If a top-tier German physicist was located in what was soon to be the Soviet zone, American units were authorized to snatch them and their equipment before the Red Army arrived. This was the birth of a logistical operation that treated human beings as high-value hardware. The military necessity of winning the war was being eclipsed by the strategic necessity of winning the peace that would be defined by who possessed the secrets of the atom and the rocket. As the German front lines collapsed, the chaos provided the perfect cover for this unprecedented intellectual plunder. In the laboratories of Peenemünde and the chemical plants of IG Farben, the paper trail of the Reich's most horrific and brilliant achievements was being frantically packed into crates. The silent harvest had begun, and the first casualties were the truths of how these technologies had been developed on the backs of the starved and the broken. This transition from open combat to clandestine acquisition set the stage for a moral compromise that would haunt the post-war era. The true key to unlocking the Reich's secrets was found not in a laboratory, but in a toilet. In March 1945, a Polish lab technician at Bonn University noticed a frantic German official trying to flush a mass of documents down a drain. The pipes clogged, and the technician salvaged the damp scraps, handing them over to the Allied intelligence services. These scraps form the Ozenberg-Lista master directory of the Third Reich's scientific elite. This document was the ultimate roadmap for the silent harvest. It contained the names, locations, and specializations of thousands of engineers, physicists, and chemists who had been recalled from the front lines to work on Hitler's final gambit for victory. With this list in hand, the Allied hunt shifted from a generalized search into a high-stakes, targeted manhunt. The military environment was now a frantic patchwork of special interest zones. While the 1st and 3rd U.S. armies were liberating concentration camps, the intelligence officers of Operation Paperclip were often just miles ahead or behind them, focused on a different prize. In late April 1945, the Americans discovered the secret archives of the German High Command hidden in a forest near Goslar. These files revealed that the Germans had successfully developed sarin and soman nerve agents so lethal they could kill in seconds. The Allies had no equivalent. The realization that the war had ended just before these weapons could be deployed sent a shockwave through the Pentagon. The mission changed. It was no longer enough to win. The Allies had to ensure that these truths didn't fall into the hands of a Soviet Union that was becoming increasingly hostile. By May 8, 1945, VE Day, the guns officially fell silent, but the Black Plains and Ghost convoys were just starting to move. Under the cover of the total administrative collapse of Germany, the Americans initiated Operation Overcast, later renamed Paperclip. They began inviting scientists to the United States, often moving them and their families in the dead of night to avoid detection by the British or French, and certainly to stay clear of the Soviet NKVD. The Soviets, for their part, launched Operation Osovyakim, a massive pre-dawn sweep on October 22, 1946, where they forcibly recruited over 2,000 German specialists and their families at gunpoint, loading them onto trains destined for the Russian interior. This desperate scramble for intellectual capital meant that the formal surrender was a facade. Behind the scenes, the wartime alliances were being shredded over the possession of a wind tunnel or a chemical formula. The documents revealed a world where the moral depravity of the Nazi regime, the human experimentation. The slave labor at Nordhausen was being meticulously filed away and sanitized. If a scientist was valuable enough, his SS record was scrubbed, his crimes were reclassified as administrative duties, and he was given a clean bill of health to enter the American or Soviet military-industrial complex. The truth of the war remained hidden, because the victors had decided that the future of their own national security was worth the price of a few thousand pardoned war criminals. This era of useful amnesia would define the next 4 decades of global history. As the pioneers of the moon landing and the Cold War, arms race were often the same men who had designed the machinery of the Holocaust. The recruitment of the Reich's scientific apparatus presents 2 starkly contrasting perspectives: the moral angle and the technological angle. From the moral angle, Operation Paperclip stands as one of the most controversial ethical compromises in the history of modern warfare. As the guns fell silent, the Allied Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency faced a harrowing choice: bring the architects of Nazi terror to justice or bring them to America. The secret documents of the 1940s reveal a calculated process of whitewashing. Scientists who were deeply embedded in the S-men like Hubertus Strughold, who was later linked to horrific human experimentation at Dachau, had their security dossiers altered. Phrases like ardent Nazi were deleted and replaced with not a political threat. This moral maneuver was executed under the cold logic that the truth of their crimes was less valuable than the technical expertise they possessed. It created a shadow history where the victims of slave labor at the middlework were ignored so that their overseers could be given American citizenship and high-ranking government positions. In sharp contrast, the technological angle views this same period as a mandatory jump start for the modern world. Without the capture of German wind tunnel data and rocket telemetry, the United States and the Soviet Union would have remained stuck in the era of propeller-driven flight and primitive ballistics for another decade. The documents from the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base archives show that the American X-planes and the early jet age were built directly upon the swept-wing designs stolen from the Messerschmitt and Arado factories. The technological angle suggests that the transition from World War II to the space age was not an American or Soviet victory, but a German inheritance. We see this in the development of the Redstone rocket, the vehicle that would eventually put the first American in space, which was essentially a refined, scaled-up version of the V-2. From this perspective, the hidden truth wasn't just a secret. It was the essential fuel for the 20th century's greatest achievements, proving that the tools of destruction could be repurposed for exploration, provided the world was willing to look away from the blood on the blueprints. This duality created a world where the heroes of the new frontier often had skeletons in their closets that were classified at the highest levels of national security. The technological leap was undeniable, but it was purchased with a currency of silence that fundamentally altered the Western world's moral compass. As these scientists began their new lives in Huntsville, Alabama, and the secret laboratories of the USSR, the tactical hunt for the ultimate prize, the nuclear secret, entered its most dangerous phase. The final layers of the silent harvest are revealed through the geopolitical angle and the tactical angle, specifically regarding the race for atomic supremacy. From the geopolitical angle, the summer of 1945 was not a time of peace, but the frantic opening gambit of the Cold War. The documents from the ALSO's mission, the secret Allied unit tasked with uncovering the German nuclear program, show that the alliance with the Soviet Union had already effectively ended before the Japanese surrender. American and British intelligence were terrified that the Red Menace would secure German uranium and the physicists who knew how to use it. This led to Operation Epsilon, where 10 top German scientists, including Werner Heisenberg and Otto Hahn, were kidnapped and detained at Farm Hall in England. The transcripts of their bugged conversations reveal a geopolitical chess match. The West was not just keeping these men from the gallows, they were keeping them from Stalin. The hidden truth here is that the Cold War didn't start with the Berlin blockade in 1948. It was born in the laboratories of 1945, fueled by the fear that the next war would be fought with German-designed nuclear weapons. Parallel to this was the tactical angle, a gritty, ground-level struggle for heavy water and raw materials. While the public celebrated the liberation of cities, tactical teams were conducting high-risk raids into the Russian zone to seize caches of uranium, ore, and specialized equipment. The documents detail the raid on the Stassfurt salt mines, where American troops recovered 1,100 tons of uranium, the very material that would eventually be used in the Manhattan Project. This was a tactical war of grab and run. The reports describe American trucks racing toward the Western lines just hours before Soviet tanks arrived to claim the same territory. These tactical maneuvers were often conducted without the knowledge of the local commanders, operating under a direct line of authority from Washington. It was a war of logistics and theft, where the prize was not a city or a bridge, but a canister of isotope-enriched water. These two angles converged to show a world where the formal end of hostilities was merely a distraction. The tactical recovery of materials and the geopolitical hoarding of mines created a new global hierarchy. The documents prove that the stability of the post-war world was built on a foundation of stolen secrets and clandestine raids. As the scientists were settled into their new roles and the uranium was processed into American and Soviet warheads, the focus shifted to the massive industrial complexes where these secrets were first born, the underground factories that would become the climax of this hidden history. The Invisible War reached its boiling point in April 1945, centered on a location that didn't exist on any conventional map, the Mittelwerk. Located inside the Kohnstein Mountain near Nordhausen, this was the heart of the Reich's rocket production. As the U.S. 3rd Armored Division pushed into the Harz Mountains, they stumbled upon a nightmare of industrial scale. The documents from the TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee, and the U.S. Ordnance Department reveal that the Americans were unjust horrified by the thousands of corpses found at the adjacent Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. They were electrified by what was inside the tunnels. Row after row of nearly completed V-2 rockets, specialized machinery, and technical manuals lay ripe for the taking. The climax was a desperate, clandestine race against the clock. Under the Yalta Agreement, Nordhausen was located in the future Soviet occupation zone. The Americans knew that within weeks, they would have to hand this mountain of secrets over to the Red Army, The turning point occurred when Colonel Holger Toftoy issued an unauthorized order: empty the mountain. In a massive logistical feat that the documents describe as the greatest loot in history, American troops worked around the clock to load over 300 rail cars with V-2 components, gyroscopes, and combustion chambers. This was the moment the balance of power for the next century shifted. While Soviet trophy brigades were still miles away, the Americans were literally stealing the future from under their feet. The logistical logs show that 14 Liberty ships were waiting at the port of Antwerp to whisk this cargo to the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. When the Soviet officers finally entered the tunnels in July 1945, they found only empty shells and stripped wires. The documents reveal their fury and their immediate countermove: the rounding up of any remaining German technicians who hadn't fled west. This frantic evacuation of the middlework wasn't just a military maneuver. It was the surgical removal of the Reich's technological brain, ensuring that when the Cold War turned hot, the West would have the high ground of the atmosphere. The physical theft of the V-2 rockets was only half of the climax. The second, more permanent turning point was the systematic sanitization of the men who built them. As 1945 bled into 1946, the mission evolved from Operation Overcast into Operation Paperclip. The turning point came with a secret memo from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, that effectively bypassed President Truman's explicit order. Truman had directed that no ardent Nazis or war criminals be recruited. However, the intelligence community realized that the most brilliant minds were almost exclusively ardent Nazis. To lose them was to lose the Cold War before it began. The climax of this moral shift occurred in the offices of the Office of Military Government, United States, UMGS. Intelligence officers began a massive paperclip operation, literally clipping new, fabricated political biographies to the scientists' files. The documents show that Werner von Braun's dossier was rewritten to frame his SS rank as a technical necessity rather than a political choice. Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen the brutal slave labor at the middlework, had his record scrubbed of any mention of the hanging of prisoners from the factory cranes. This wasn't just a bureaucratic loophole. It was a fundamental shift in the American state's relationship with the truth. This policy created a point of no return. By 1947, over 1,000 German scientists had been funneled into American military bases and research centers. The documents from this era reveal a state of controlled amnesia. While the Nuremberg trials were hanging the visible villains of the Reich, the invisible architects were being given homes in Alabama and Ohio. This was the moment the truth remained hidden by design. The United States had decided that national survival in the atomic age outweighed the pursuit of transitional justice. This decision effectively institutionalized the secret, ensuring that the origins of the American space and weapons programs would remain a classified, sanitized myth for the next 50 years. The immediate fallout of Operation Paperclip was a surreal integration that reshaped the American and Soviet landscapes. By the late 1940s, the silent harvest had transplanted a significant portion of the German intelligentsia into the heart of the world's two new superpowers. In the United States, the sleepy town of Huntsville, Alabama, was transformed into Rocket City, USA. The documents from the Redstone Arsenal show that Werner von Braun and his team weren't just employees. They were the masters of the American ballistics program. They lived in a strange bubble of protection where their pasts were never discussed, and their German accents became synonymous with scientific progress rather than the blitzkrieg. In the Soviet Union, the aftermath was more brutal but equally effective. Under Operation Osovykim, the thousands of German specialists taken to the USSR were housed in closed cities like Gorodomlya Island. The Soviet Internal Security (NKVD) reports reveal a system of golden cages. The scientists were given higher salaries and better rations than the starving Russian populace, but they were kept behind barbed wire, their work monitored by armed guards. The document trail shows that the Soviets were less interested in whitewashing these men and more interested in draining their knowledge before discarding them. By 1952, most of the German specialists in the USSR were repatriated, but they left behind the blueprints for the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. The consequence was a world locked in a technological stalemate built on a single German foundation. The documents of the early 1950s arms race read like a dialogue between former colleagues. American and Soviet rocket telemetry from this period shows a startling similarity because both sides were essentially iterating on the same V2 physics. The hidden truth was that the Cold War was in many ways a proxy war between two groups of German scientists competing to see whose new masters would dominate the heavens. This created a strategic psychology of perpetual escalation. Because each side knew exactly what the other was capable of, neither could afford to stop. The silence of 1945 had evolved into the high-altitude roar of the 1950s, a sound that masked the uncomfortable reality that the free world and the Iron Curtain were both being propped up by the same dark genius. The long-term consequence of this silent harvest was the permanent sanitization of the 20th century's historical narrative. As the 1960s approached and the Apollo program took center stage, the men of paperclip were elevated to the status of American folk heroes. The documents from NASA's early public relations offices show a concerted effort to deflect any questions regarding the origins of the Saturn V rocket. Verifiable reports from the GAO General Accounting Office in 1999 finally confirmed that the U.S. government had engaged in a massive, decades-long cover-up to shield these scientists from investigation. The shift in psychology was total. For the sake of winning the space race and the Cold War, the atrocities of the past were reclassified as irrelevant data points. This sanitization had a corrosive effect on global ethics. The documents reveal that the paperclip model became a template for how the great powers handled high-value intelligence. When the truth of the nerve gas experiments or the rocket factory hangings finally began to leak out through declassified archives in the 1970s and 80s, the public was met with a wall of national security justifications. The moral cost was a gradual erosion of the principle of accountability. By choosing technological superiority over justice, the victors of World War II inadvertently proved that genius could buy immunity from even the most heinous crimes. Even the physical landscape of history was altered. The underground tunnels of the Middlework were sealed or allowed to flood, and many of the research labs in Peenemünde were demolished by the Soviets. The hidden truth was not just buried in paper, it was buried in the earth itself. As the 20th century closed, the numbers were finally tallied. Over 1,600 German scientists had been brought to the U.S. History is a narrative of noise, the thunder of artillery, the roar of crowds, the declarations of victory. But, as we have seen through the dark corridors of the Middlework and the sanitized dossiers of Operation Paperclip, the most defining moments of the 20th century occurred in total silence. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the world believed the war was over. In reality, the conflict had simply shed its skin. It transformed from a battle of territory into a battle of intellect, where the spoils were not gold or land, but the mathematical secrets of the atom and the stars. The hidden truth of the post-war era is a grounded, sobering reality. The peace that followed World War II was not built on a foundation of pure justice, but on a pillar of pragmatic amnesia. We must confront the fact that the same hands that designed the engines of the Holocaust also built the ladders to the moon. This realization doesn't diminish the greatness of the space age, but it adds a necessary, haunting shadow to it. It reminds us that progress often carries a moral weight that we are not always prepared to measure. Today, the legacy of the silent harvest is all around us. It is in the GPS satellites that guide our cars, the jet engines that shrink our world, and the nuclear deterrents that have, however tenuously, prevented another global conflagration. We live in a house built by ghostmen whose crimes were filed away in the name of national survival. As we look back on those frantic months of 1945, we are forced to reflect on the true cost of our modern world. The silence that began in the tunnels of the Harz Mountains eventually became the quiet hum of the 21st century. It is a reminder that while the truth can be hidden, scrubbed, or classified, it never truly disappears. It remains there, beneath the surface of the official record, waiting for us to acknowledge that our greatest leaps forward were often taken in the company of our darkest pasts. In the end, the most enduring lesson of the silent front is that the price of the future is often the truth of the past.